presenting ideas. Now, these can be educational-based presentations. These can be persuasive presentations where you're trying to persuade someone to do what you want them to do. The idea is that we're presenting an idea. Later, we'll get into reporting-based presentations where you're just trying to report back on what's going on. So the presenting ideas structure is a 4-step structure. So you don't have to memorize it. Again, we're recording. But if you've ever been in a presentation where you could tell the audience just didn't really care, even if the information was important, that's because the presenter didn't do the first step. And the first step is talking to your audience about why they should care. Now, what's interesting here when we start digging into it is when you're talking to your audience about why they should care, we do mean them, the person, not necessarily the organization. We all make decisions based on ourselves. We're all inherently selfish. Something for the organization might be good for us, but learning why it's good for us personally really does matter. Normally, during our PowerPoint psychology class, we pick a real presentation and start listing out why people should care. And what's interesting, because it's human nature, is that normally we write all the good things that people will get if they pay attention to us. Now, this is where it starts getting really interesting, because telling people a whole bunch of good things that they'll get doesn't make people make motivational-based decisions. I mean, you've been there where you've said, hey, you should totally do this. You'll get this, and you'll get this, and you'll get this. And people go, meh, and they kind of, go away, and you're left scratching your head with what's wrong with that person. Well, nothing's wrong with them. The thing is that you didn't understand that when people make a motivation-based decision, most of the time they make it to avoid a problem, not to get something good. So the A+ way of talking about step 1 of introducing your topic is talking to people about all the problems that they'll get if they don't listen to what you have to say today. Now, we're not talking about going negative. What we're doing is uncovering what really happens. We're uncovering realistic things. So, for example, if you don't learn how to get good with PowerPoint, your audience might be bored, right? Now people are connected to it. They're like, yeah, people are bored, and they're ready to listen. That's why step 1 is talking to people about why they should care. Now, it's important that you understand that I do mean these are the very first words that come out of your mouth are about why people should care. Now people are primed. Now they care. We have this really interesting thing as human beings that when we have a solution, that when we have a problem and then we're presented with a topic, we see that topic as a solution. Advertising knows this. They say things like, is your network going down? And then they show their logo saying, hey, we're the solution. That's why step 1 is talking to people about why they should care. And step 2 is announcing the topic. Now, the thing is, people understand why they're there. It's not a surprise. What we're doing is walking them through a story. We're walking them through a psychological method that's involved to get them to care as much as they can. So when you talk to people about problems that'll occur, and then you announce the topic, that sounds something along the lines of, we've all been in those PowerPoint presentations where the whole audience was just bored or all over the place. That's why we're going to talk about getting better with PowerPoint and learn interesting tips with PowerPoint psychology. So after announcing the topic, now you've got people on your side. The thing is that although people do make motivation-based decisions to avoid a negative, people don't like to continue on with a negative in their mind. That's why so many people have so much trouble quitting smoking or going to the gym or really anything that starts off with I have to do something to avoid a bad thing. We have a much easier time continuing motivation to get something good. So the best part of step 2 is when you announce the topic, then you also get to tell people all of the rainbows and puppies and other great things that they'll get if they listen to your presentation today. And now we're moving forward into a positive. Make sense? Okay, so step 1 is get them interested, talk about the problems they'll avoid. Step 2 is announcing the topic. And then step 3 is a step that we all do already anyway. Step 3 is really about discussing details. Now the thing is though, if you had to guess about how long the average adult attention span is, what do you think you'd guess? Well, it kind of depends on how it's measured. If they say attention span is the ability to stay on task, then generally it's measured somewhere around 7 to 11 minutes, depending on who you're talking to. But if they measure actual brain activity, it breaks down into the seconds. So you're sitting up there talking for 20 minutes and you expect people to stay on track? It's not really going to happen. It's not realistic. So the big part of step 3 is about every 5 to 7 minutes, you have to pick people up and put them back on track. Now, that's not a review. You're not going over everything you already talked about. It's just basically reminding people where they are. And if you want to get all advanced on it, reminding them where they're going. So that sounds something like, so remember, the first step is getting people interested, and then you announce the topic, and now we're discussing details. And in a minute, we're going to talk about step 4 because there's only 4 steps. That's putting people back on track. Psychologists love to measure. They need a number associated with things. So they say 5 to 7 minutes. But really, most of the time, when we look around the room, we can kind of feel when we've reached people's maximum attention. Grab them, put them back on track. And now we're ready for step 4. Remember, the whole reason that we're giving a presentation is so that we put something in people's brains, so that they do something for us, or so that we get something. You've been to very interesting presentations and then you leave and you're thinking, wow, that's a lot of stuff. I don't really know what I should, take from that. That was the presenter's fault because they didn't know step 4 like you were about to know. So here's step 4. Ready? Check out the screen. You, the presenter, tell the audience what to remember. That sounds like, so the important part is this, or so what you want to remember out of all of this is this, or so what the takeaways are is meh, or the action steps, really anything that you say that lets people know this is the important part to remember. Ooh, you watch them wake up. And now you've rolled up all of this education, all of these ideas that you presented people with into one nice takeaway. I mean, because otherwise people are going to try and decide what they have to remember all on their own. Don't make people work. Do it for them. You tell people what to remember. So the whole presenting ideas cycle looks kind of like this. First, you talk to people about why they care, and then you announce the topic. So you don't announce the topic first. You announce it second. Then you talk about what you're talking about, and then tell people what to remember. Out of all of this, you don't really have to remember these 4 steps. If you remember there are steps, then you can just go back and look at this video again next time that you build a presentation. Do you see what step I just did? I just did step number 4. It feels good, doesn't it? By the way, it's not easy for people to talk about why the audience should care first, and presenters often forget to tell people what to remember. So if it doesn't come natural to you, that's because it's not a natural speaking cycle. It's a natural listening cycle, though. When you give people ideas in this cycle, you're really plugging into the way that we all like to learn. Interesting, yeah? Well, here's something else that's interesting. If you're in a meeting reporting back on the project, this doesn't work out so well. You can't stand in a meeting and talk to people about why they should care. I mean, they know already. And so we're going to have to talk about what the best way to report is. By the way, did you see me just bring up a problem and then announce the topic? It works, doesn't it? So when we report back in a meeting, really, it's so nice if we have a structure that makes things smooth and quick and fast, and when you're done, everyone knows you're done. This structure was invented by the US military, who are pretty big into reporting, really, and they're also very, very big into structure, and they're big into acronyms, which is why they came up with STAR. Here's how STAR works. The situation was that people were killing their audiences with PowerPoint. So I was tasked with coming up with a class for a PowerPoint psychology based. So I was tasked with coming up with a class that was based in psychology to help people get better with PowerPoint. I built a class. It took us about a week to build, and then we started giving it. It was amazing. I'd recommend that you call Learnit and sign up your whole company for PowerPoint psychology classes. Right, so the idea is that even if everyone in the class knows even if everyone in the audience knows the situation and the task, when you talk to them about, okay, here's what was happening, and so we were going to do this, it puts everybody back in a frame of mind to really listen. Then you talk about your actions and what happened. And the important word out of all of these is recommend. Recommend is a really interesting word because it's a powerful word. Strong, important people make recommendations. And yet it's not a word that offends people the same way that should does. If you say we should do this or we should do that, it's a prickly word, isn't it? When you make a recommendation, I recommend we do this, it raises your status without offending people. It's a really powerful word. And on top of that, it gives closure. When you make a recommendation at the end of your presentation, everybody knows you're finished. There's no weird, okay, so I guess I'm done, I guess. You know how a lot of presentations end like that? Making a recommendation is a really smooth way to leave your presentation. Now, the nice thing about it is it doesn't need to be a very strong recommendation. You can recommend that people come talk to you if they have any questions. You can recommend that people use your data and do with it what they will. The idea is using the word raises status. So steps 1 through 4, make them your own. Step 5, make sure you use the word recommendation. So here we've got 2 methods really that you can use to report back in your meetings. You've got the 4-step presenting ideas method, and you've got STAR. It's nice to have a structure, isn't it? So now that we have a structure that we can map our presentations to, now we need to start talking about content, about what are we actually going to put in our slides. And you can't start talking about put this in and put this in when you already put a lot of things in your slides. And so we need to talk a little bit about what's actually bad with PowerPoint and what are people trying to achieve. So for example, we've all seen slides like this. I can just hear about half of you going, ugh, on the other end. Okay, let's get our first couple of building slides tips. Let's talk about font size. There are certain font sizes where when you go below a certain size, people just can't read it. That statistically, people in the room can't read it. And that's when you fall below 24-point font. So below 24-point font, somebody in the room can't read it. Not you with your perfect vision sitting in the front row, but, if you can imagine someone else. However, if you choose 25-point font, that doesn't mean it's easy to read. What you want is absorption level size text. So that's when people just look at something and they can just absorb it. Absorption level starts at around 32-point font. So if you're going to make a rule for yourself, in general you want to avoid having font sizes below 32 point. I know that sounds really big, and it is big for a Microsoft Word document, but for screen display it's really not. Here's another rule that we can pull out of this. In general, if you show someone more than 2 lines of text together, people don't want to read it. Do you see how painful this slide looks? You don't even want to read it, do you? If you want people to actually read things, and you have more than 2 lines of text together, you might want to rethink it because the research shows people start skipping like crazy, or they won't even look at the slide. They just avoid looking at it. Neat, isn't it? Okay. Check out this slide. Here's the interesting thing. As humans, we're very, very good at a lot of things. But one of the things that we're not good at is processing 2 language inputs at the same time. You've experienced this when you've watched movies with subtitles. It kind of tends to sort of wreck a movie, doesn't it? And you've experienced the idea that as soon as you show people something with PowerPoint, they're going to read it. You can't tell people not to read something for a little while. right? So out of this, we get two pretty big presentation-based tips. One, if you show someone text, stop and let them read it. They're going to anyway. If you're talking over them, you're just getting in the way of their brain. You've been there where people show you text and you're like, I'm trying to read, stop talking to me. Right? That's how it works. Make sense? Okay. Great. Here, let's bring up a little bit of animation here. I know none of you are making slides that look like this, but slides like this do exist. So we're going to make a couple of little rules. Ready? Here we go. No clip art ever. Wait. When should you have clip art? Never, ever, ever. Except for on certain times, right? No, pretty much never. The thing is that back in 1994, everybody was impressed that there was a drawing on the computer. But nowadays, it just looks juvenile. There are tons and tons of professional photographs that you can use to make your PowerPoint presentations shine. Why would you wreck it with juvenile little animations? Now, animations in general, there are a lot of really cool animations in PowerPoint. The thing is, you can use a cool animation one time during a presentation. When? During the moment that you might consider the climactical moment or the ta-da moment of a presentation. If you can picture yourself saying, ta-da, then you can have a cool animation. The thing is even the hardened CEO will say, oh, that was pretty cool, it just did a little thing. But if you try and do it again 5 minutes later, half of the audience is rolling their eyes, and the other half of the audience is kind of saying, oh, I wonder what it'll do next, both of which are killing your message. So if you're going to use fancy animations, you get one chance. And you'll want to avoid clip art pretty much all the time ever. Good? Okay. So we're about to move into one of the most important things with PowerPoint that even people who are conscientious tend to mess up over and over and over again. And that's using PowerPoint for more than one thing at the same time. So for example, if you're trying to use PowerPoint as a presentation tool, and you're also trying to use it as handouts, or trying to use it as notes, or trying to use it as a book or a poster or something like that, here's what happens. When you try to use PowerPoint for two different purposes at the same time, it's going to fail at one of them. So, for example, you've seen this a whole bunch of times. Somebody brings up a slide and just starts reading it to you. And how do you feel that whole time? Right? I mean, it's pretty awful. And if you start thinking about, well, if we all know that reading to me off of a slide is horrible, then why are people doing it? And usually what it breaks down to is because people don't have the presentation memorized, right? I mean, really, it's not that reasonable to decide that, hey, you have to memorize all of your presentations from now on. And so instead, what you have to do is figure out some sort of way that you don't have to memorize the presentation, but you also don't still have to sit here and read to people off of the slides. And they could have stayed home and read. Now, there are a couple of different options. One of the options is print notes. Nobody ever sits in an audience and says, hey, she's got notes, what's going on here? Like, people are perfectly fine with that. If you'd rather not use notes, here, check this out. I've got two monitors that I'm using today. And on the monitor that you see, you guys see this. On my other monitor, I see this. This is a really interesting view that's been with PowerPoint for a very long time called the presenter view. Here's what's neat about it. Up in this area, I see this is the slide that the audience sees. Notice that down underneath, I can see all the bullets, so I know what's coming up next. These are my presenter notes. It even tells me how long I've been talking. This view is called the presenter view, and you can find it by going up to the slideshow tab and turning on presenter view. Now, you do have to be connected into a projector or a second monitor for it to work. So you might want to get on your best friend Google and ask them, how do I use the presenter view? So it's a nice little it's a nice note system that's built into PowerPoint so that you don't have to read to people off the slide. I mean, but really, you could also just print notes. Making sense? Okay, great. So one of the other problems that people have with PowerPoint is they try and stuff a whole bunch of things onto the PowerPoint so that they can use the PowerPoint as handouts, right? We've all been there where people said, oh, can you send me the PowerPoint? And really what they're asking for is a handout, right? Well, the problem is if you're trying to use PowerPoint as a good display, it makes a horrible handout. On the other hand, if you make a PowerPoint presentation that actually is a good handout, it's awful, awful, awful to your audience when they're sitting there in the room. So here are your choices. 1, go ahead and be awful. I don't love that choice, so I'm going to go with one of the other ones. The other choices are A, make a handout. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. You make an outline in Microsoft Word, and you add your notes into the handout and any other tables or extra data, and now you're done. That's your handout. Or you can take your text-heavy slides and put them at the end of the presentation. That way you tell people when you send it to them that the first slides are really for visual presentation, and then the ones at the end have more details if you're looking for that. So it's win-win. The real idea, though, is if you try to use PowerPoint as notes, or you try to use PowerPoint as a handout, it's going to fail horribly at one of them. And generally, what ends up suffering is the in-person presentation. Neat, right? Well, now that you have options, that's great. Generally, right around this time is when people start talking about, well, what about data, though, when you're doing data presentation? Because I've seen an awful lot of slides that look something like this. And, data presentations are sometimes some of the worst, aren't they? Okay, a couple of things are important here. 1, anytime there's anything extra that the audience's brain has to discount, it actually lowers understanding and lowers retention. So here, we see all kinds of interesting stuff going on over on the side that doesn't need to be there at all, including this royal flush, although royal flushes are pretty cool, right? Let's say that I'm talking about the salesperson and what their totals were. There's so much extraneous data here that it gets in my way. But let's say that that didn't even exist. Let's say it was no problem, that our audience could totally interpret all of it, and they could see font sizes below 24 and everything was great. If you do something like this, you're still asking for it, like just straight up asking for it. What are you asking for? You're asking for somebody right in the middle of your presentation to go, oh, hey, wait a minute. Hey, in week 3 with L Carey here, I'm not really sure about that 99 because I thought it was 12. That you're asking for somebody to interrupt you and pull you off course. If you show people information, they're going to look at it, and then asking them to ignore it isn't really going to happen either. So here's what the experts say that when you're presenting data that you should really stick to. That if you're presenting the totals, you just show the totals. So the idea is you only show the data that you're presenting right now. Now it's impossible to pull you off track. If, however, you work in an organization where they need to see that data, a heavily science-based organization or a heavily numbers-based organization, sometimes they can't listen to you unless they know that there's data behind the scenes. Well, that's okay. Then you do something like this. You say, okay, we're going to talk about sales figures from July 2010. In a little bit, I'm going to give you guys a handout. The handout looks like this. We can go over it. And right now, I'd like to talk about the totals. So you show them the data so that they know it exists, and then you move on to what you need to talk about. The biggest part of presenting data is to only show the data that you're presenting right now. That's the part you'll want to remember out of this part if you remember something. Oh, did you see me telling you what to remember? It feels good, doesn't it? Okay. Well, let's say that I'm going to walk people through data. Maybe we're talking about our projections for 2013. Well, it kind of looks like I need to update this PowerPoint, doesn't it? So let's say our current monthly sales are 176,000, and we're projecting an increase of about 8.5%. That means our projected monthly sales will go to about that, which makes our projected yearly sales 2,291,923. Do you see how much more effective it is when I walk you through the data? If you're going to walk people through points or walk them through data, my goodness, please walk them through it. Don't bring the data up before they need to see it. Because remember, as soon as you show something to everyone, they're going to read the whole thing. We've all been there when people showed a slide and then slowly went through the whole thing, and it's pretty painful, isn't it? Now, you might be wondering, how did David know 2,291,923 when it wasn't even on the screen? It's because I was cheating with my presenter view or with my notes, right? Okay, so there's a trick, by the way. So here's PowerPoint. Maybe I'll make a new slide here. I'll have a point and another point. And because I like to talk about a lot of things, I'll have a third point. To make these animate in one by one, there's a trick to it. You can click inside the bullet point and go up to the Animations tab up at the top and just tell it to fade. Fade is really the only classy animation. So you see them all come in one by one by one, and it even says 1, 2, 3. Now when I play the presentation, it'll wait for me to click next. So for example, I've got a point, and then maybe I'll make another point. And after that, I'll make a third point. Do you see how much more engaging it is when you bring them up one by one? Out of data, if you're going to remember one thing, you remember only show them the data that you're talking about right now. If you can push from that to one of the best ways to do that is only show people bullet points when you're talking about those bullet points, well then great. Now just so you know, I'm specifically not talking about look at all these numbers. I'm talking about when you're walking through points. If you're showing people a bunch of numbers or all of your locations on the West Coast, you can just go ahead and show it to them right away. Great. Now one of the other problems with presenting data that you've seen a whole bunch of times are are tables and charts and graphs. Here's the thing. A chart or a graph should be about telling a story, not about communicating data. If people have to interpret your chart or graph to figure out what the numbers mean, you should have just showed them numbers. A chart or a graph should say, look, it went up and then it went back down. Or look at how much this person sold than the other person. Or look at the percentage of the whole with the pie chart, that kind of thing. They're about telling stories. If you want to show people numbers, you just show them numbers. So we're really starting to talk about, let's get this off of the slide and let's get that off the slide. Only the things we're talking about right now, please don't read to people. As we go, we'll learn that less is more, less is more, less is more. But just saying less is more to people doesn't really do it. Like less is more, what am I actually supposed to do? Like really what content should actually go on the slide? I love her face. So let's talk about it. We're going to start taking things off of the slide. For example, you've got a slide like this. I know you've seen a million slides like that. And oh my goodness, most of this could have all happened out loud, right? Okay, here are the other places you can put your information. When you're building the slide, you have to have somewhere you can type things, or else you'll just end up typing it all straight on the slide, right? So you've got a handout, and you've also got your speaker notes. If this were a college class and you'd get a test at the end, which you're not going to, but if it were, one of the big test questions was where else can you put information if not on a slide? So being able to think just right away, this should go in the speaker notes, this should go in the handout, this should go in the speaker notes, this should go in the handout. Most of this could have all happened out loud, right? Do you remember when in the beginning of class I said this? Would it have been better if I had bullet points that came up as I was saying it? It probably wouldn't have been. In fact, it would probably have been less engaging, or I would have to be some kind of superstar to read it at the same exact time that you were reading it. And that doesn't really work. The thing is, subtitling doesn't help. When you watch movies with subtitling, if you already know the language, it just pulls you off track, doesn't it? Well, PowerPoint does the same thing. You don't need to write something down just because you're saying it. In fact, there are really only 2 rules that you can follow that actually do say, okay, this is helpful for you to put on the slide. There are 2 rules. If you're going to memorize something, this is what you're going to memorize. Ready? Here we go. These are the 2 questions about whether or not it should go on the slide. If you're putting something on the slide because it helps people understand what you're talking about, and we all innately get that. When we see something that helps us understand, we go, oh, thanks, that helped me understand. Well, then please put it on the slide. Now, you have to be honest with yourself. Just writing down everything that you say doesn't help people understand. Showing people a chart or a graph or an image or something along those lines that does help them understand, now great, go ahead and put it on the slide. Here's the thing though. If we see it and we understand, oh, that helps us to understand, it's an aid, then everybody in the audience totally knows what it's there for and we're all good. If it comes up on the screen and we don't really know why it's there, then we're all brought back to the same way that we were in school. Do you remember when you had those teachers who were good teachers and you liked them and they wrote something on the board and you were like, oh, that's going to be on the test, and so you wrote it down and knew to study because they wrote things on the board that were important? You also had those teachers that wrote everything on the board and you hated them. They weren't that great, right? Well, as a presenter, PowerPoint is your board. When you put something up on the PowerPoint slide, you're doing the same exact thing that teachers back in school did things with the board. If you think about it, every time somebody shows something on a PowerPoint slide, don't you find yourself saying, wait, do I have to know this? Do I have to know this? Do I have to know this? And it's kind of stressful, right? So if the content isn't there to obviously help people understand, here comes the other one. Does the audience need to remember the content? Is this the content that you're telling them to remember? If you can get a yes for either one of these, then please, please, please put it on the slide. Otherwise, remember it can go in the speaker notes or it can go in the handout. You've got a lot of different delivery methods. If there were a test, this would be the test. Let me go ahead and show you an example here. I'm going to pull it up real quick. So this is a real slide that we got from one of our clients. We kind of scrubbed all of the identifying features, I guess, in the branding, but it's real. The content's all real. It's a seasonal store where they have great big explosion of business in Christmas, and so they hire people during the special seasons to, help out, right? And so this presentation was about whether or not people should be kept after the seasonal work, and that you really want to recover and talk about all of your different options instead of just letting go of all the people who turned out to be pretty amazing. And then down at the bottom, you've got, remember, 3 good people is equal to 1 great person. Now, remember, we can take most of this and either put it in speaker notes or in the handout, right? So after moving most of this text to the speaker notes, then we come up with something like this. When we're talking to people about now's the time to ensure that they have a great plan in place, to evaluate and make sure they have the best talent working for them, this is a great slide. Remember, what we're trying to do is have people help them understand or help them remember. You can see which slide this is, right? Blah, blah, talk, 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 talk. Okay, guys, so remember, 3 good employees is the same thing as 1 great employee. And so, yeah, now we have 2 slides instead of 1. But remember what the 1 looked like? This is following the rules. It's pretty interesting, isn't it? Okay. Hold on just one second. Having a little technical thing go on. Okay, so the whole idea about like, does the content help people understand or do they need to remember the content can be your guide moving forward. Everything else, speaker notes or handout, right? But that does kind of beg the question, well, okay, but how much stuff can I have on the slide? I mean, is something like that okay? So let's say that this slide we're talking about not necessarily comparing airplanes and trains and buses and taxis, but instead we talk about airplanes for a little while, and then we talk about the train industry and where it's trending trains, then buses and taxis and so. And the idea is, if we're going to be talking about airplanes for a little while, why not use a slide specifically for airplanes? Now, admittedly, this slide is prettier because it's using some of the design aspects that we'll talk about in a little bit. But also notice that it's only addressing one thing. Back in the 90s, when multitasking was really big, they did a study at Columbia University about what's the best way to multitask. And what they found was really interesting. What they found was that multitasking doesn't even exist. That when we're working in our conscious brain, in our cerebral cortex, that we really only think about one thing at a time. And so when we're multitasking, what we're really doing is totally jumping ship and changing subject for our brain. You know when you get in the zone and you're so much better at working what you're working on? The zone generally happens somewhere between 7 and 14 minutes. So if you're jumping, you can never really get in that zone. The people who are the best at multitasking are 60% less efficient than if they just focus on one thing at a time. So when we're talking about PowerPoint, what that really breaks down to is, okay, well, how many things should I address on a slide at one time? And here's the answer: one topic. If our brains are built to think about one thing at a time, why give people more than one thing to talk about, or why give people more than one thing to think about? Now note that I'm not saying more than that. Note that I'm not saying only one bullet point per slide, that I'm saying one topic per slide. So if a topic has a couple of different points, go ahead, that's fine. It's just don't address a form and a chart and a graph and some numbers and a whole bunch of other things that are basically different ideas. If you're going to have content takeaways, here they are. Does the content help people understand? Does the audience need to remember the content? And as you go, one topic per slide is about the most that you can use. Making sense? Great. So if we've got slide content now we kind of have to move into making things look pretty. And so there are basically two different areas as far as normal people making slides look pretty. We're not graphic designers, and we don't have a million years to work on each slide, so this stuff needs to happen fast. Let's talk about imagery first. If you're using images to help people understand, then great. Here's the product that we're about to sell, this lovely Learnit Anytime book. Or here's a chart that tells a story about how our different salespeople are doing. Great, you're helping people to understand. Otherwise, images are about influence. In choosing your images, you can influence your audience to make them think or feel a certain way. Now, we all like images, and it's important to note that every professional publication uses images. So if you see Bankers Weekly or The Economist or the Wall Street Journal, there are a lot of images in there. Using them in a professional, non-cheesy way is going to be the important part for you. So if you're going to use images to influence, we need to talk about what the best kind of image actually looks like. Here, check this out. This type of image is the best type of image. There are three things that go into an image having the most transfer. So we're talking about emotional transfer or intellectual transfer. And here they are. 1, we relate to people. We don't really relate or empathize with sunsets or buildings or trees. So if you're trying to get your audience to feel or think a certain way, you show them an image of a person feeling or thinking about a certain way. If you don't want to use great big images because you feel maybe that's not appropriate, You can use smaller images, and it has a little bit more of a professional impact. But do you see how looking at this little girl hits you in a human sort of way? Where looking at this camera, although it looks a little bit better, doesn't hit you in any kind of emotional sort of way. So the number one rule with imagery is to use people. Now, really what's going on when we're letting images influence us is we're imagining that those images are more real in our brain than they really are. So anything that you can do to make the image more real is incredibly helpful for influencing your audience. When you're walking down the street, you never see somebody walking down the street with a big weird box behind them, but most of the images that we put on the screen have boxes around them, like the borders for the image. The best type of image is a borderless image. So do you notice how this girl here doesn't really have a background? And it looks pretty cool, doesn't it? Even that camera I had up a minute ago doesn't have a background, and it looks pretty cool. Even this airplane that we had a little bit ago, notice that there's not any kind of border edge to it, that it takes up the whole screen. So it's sort of the same sort of thing. It's a natural background. Remember this girl? These types of images, the ones that don't have edges to them, that don't have a big square or unnatural edge, is the most effective kind. So there are 3 rules. People, no hard edge, so we're talking about no background basically. And then here's the last rule. Images that are slid halfway off the screen like this are statistically much more effective images. They're not exactly sure why that is, but they think it's because if you see half of something, your brain goes crazy imagining the rest of it. It's probably evolutionary based, because if you see half of a lion and you don't imagine the rest of the lion, well, you don't get to pass on your genes. So through evolution, we all imagine like crazy when we see part of an image. So sliding an image halfway off the screen not only gives us more room to put content, and let's face it, that's what PowerPoint's all about, but it works better and it looks better and it feels artsy. So the 3 rules really are halfway off the screen, no strong background, and use images of people. Now, one of the really interesting things that you can do relates to this. If you walk down the street and you see 4 people kind of looking straight up and turning in circles a little bit, you have no choice. You're going to look up. Again, it's through evolution. Well, we're not quite as evolved as we like to think we are, because it works with photographs too. We have a course called Influencing Without Authority, which is all about getting people to do things when you can't just tell them to do things. And during that course, we try to make it real right away. We try to have the audience, the students basically, think about person in their real life that they want to influence. And then they'll aim the class at that person. Do you see how looking at this woman makes you think? It makes you imagine. We have this weird thing with us that when we see someone doing something, we kind of tend to do that too. So when we see someone imagining, or when we see someone thinking, or when we see someone being concerned or being accepting, we're influenced to do the same thing. So you, as a presenter, can choose images that are acting the way you want your audience to make, and you sort of nudge them in that direction. It's fascinating, isn't it? Okay, so really, if we're going to bring the whole thing down to a couple of different points right now, does the content help them understand? Do they need to remember the content? Keep it down to 1 topic per slide, and please use your images for influence, not just because you thought it'd be cool to stick an image in. Now, we've got imagery, and we've got a lot of rules about what goes on the slide, and that's great. But the slide can still look like a great big mess. For example, let's say that you're trying to hire an accountant. If you're looking at this image here, the lady on the left, okay, the guy on the right, well, he has a calculator, right? If you were to compare and contrast, one of the things that you would see with the lady over there on the left is that she's so much cleaner than the guy over on the right. When an evolutionary biologist talks about clean, they talk about safety. If you're clean, you don't get diseases. When cognitive researchers talk about clean, they say, no, that's not what clean is at all. Clean is easy for your brain. If a design is easy, when your brain looks at it and goes, oh yeah, great, then we see it and it feels so much cleaner. Well, what's nice is we've been studying our brains for quite a while, and so there are 3 big rules for design about how to make something look clean. And they're nice rules because you can apply them every single place that you ever go. I'm going to open up a PowerPoint here, and I'm going to mess with it some. And while doing so, I'll teach you guys the 3 rules. So here we've got ourselves a yucky sort of PowerPoint presentation. Real quick, I'm going to get in here and I'm going to change all the font to something that is a little bit more modern looking, a sort of sans serif font maybe. You can even use Calibri, which is the standard one that comes with Microsoft now. I'm going to unbold them. And I'm going to turn these bullet points back to normal. I'm also going to get rid of this awful clip art because no clip art ever, right? Okay, so let's talk about the different rules that we're going to follow. What we're really doing is watching the way that our brains work. Here's how it goes. When our brains first see something, the first thing they do is try to decide where the different parts are. Generally, the way that works is your brain looks at spacing. Things that are together, it assumes they go together. Things that are apart, it assumes those are separate things. You notice in here how the spacing is even between the logo as it is from the bullet points? And do you see how your brain sort of swims a little bit here? Like your eyes just sort of go over the whole thing? If I were to do something like this, just kind of open that up, now all of a sudden we start seeing that, oh, okay, our brain can kind of tell where the differences are between the two, right? Okay, grouping like objects is important. You notice here with the bullet points, they're closer to each other than they are to the title. So the first thing that your brain does is it looks in there and decides where are the different things, right? The second thing your brain does, which will lead us to our second design rule, is try to decide what's important. If your brain comes in and looks at this, it can't really tell what's important and what it should be paying attention to. Here's a really interesting thing. Something that's built into us is when we see something bigger, we assume it's more important. Like if you think about a city skyline, the biggest building is the most important building, right? You're watching the Nature Channel, the biggest elephant is like, oh, that's the leader elephant. The same thing is true in all of graphic design. So if we did something like this, now you can tell the important part of the slide, right, is about online resources. Well, remember, this is a graphic design. It's not a term paper. So we can come in and even within these different bullet points, we can set importance modifiers here. Now your brain looks at it and says, oh, these are the online resources and its pictures and detailed descriptions and visual tours. When you make something bigger, it just needs to be obviously noticeably bigger. So we might bump that down a little bit. And maybe I'll bump that down. Maybe I'll bump this one down. Do you see how much easier it is to look at right now? Okay, so we've only got one other thing. Your brain separates with space, and then it tries to decide what's important. So you'll go around to all of your slides and say, this should be bigger than that because it's more important, and this should be smaller because it's more important. Generally, just so you know, don't step more than 3 different levels of size and importance. Okay, here's the last thing. After your brain decides what's important, then your brain tries to figure it out. Now, when we figure things out, generally what we're doing is recognizing patterns. So you don't actually have to make it easy to figure out the slide. You just have to make it look easy. If your brain looks at it and goes, oh yeah, I can do that, then it feels really good. So basically what you'll do is you'll make patterns on the slide. And the easiest pattern is a straight line. So if you're going to make patterns, here's the last rule. Line everything up. So check it out. Maybe I'll line this up to this side like this. I'm going to line it up on the bullet points like that there. Right. Now I could go looking for an image or something like that to stick in here. I'd probably use a person. But if I save this, we moved from this to this very quickly, and it's all about alignment, make the big stuff important, and separate things out into their own separate little areas. Those are the big things with design.